This is the Cycling Over 60 podcast, episode 10, A Different Kind of Flexibility, and I'm your host, Tom Butler. Welcome once again to my journey to bike the 206-mile Seattle-Portland ride, coming up now in 50 days. I hit the 50th training ride last week. February and April were bad months for me, so I haven't got as many rides in as I would have liked. But I don't think I'm underprepared for the STP. My training has shifted significantly. Everything is about riding in a way that I can build muscle to get up hills. In order to build muscle, I have made two changes. One, I have slowed down my cadence and started pushing bigger gears. I slowed from around 100 RPMs to 85 to 90 RPMs. This makes a huge difference. The second change is that I'm focused on riding a much tougher hill than I have been training on so far, and I have dramatically changed my intensity. In the past, I have talked about keeping my heart rate at about 135 beats per minute during the training. On this new hill ride, I'm letting it get up to 160 beats per minute. This means much more stress on my legs. My preferred training route is now an 11-mile loop with 590 feet of elevation gain that happens over 3 miles. I do the loop twice, which gives me a kind of interval training with an 8-mile flat section in between. I can't wait to see the impact of doing this ride a couple times a week. I currently need to step off the bike several times to get up the hill. It will be huge if I can make it without stepping off at all in the next 50 days. I still have a lot of logistics to work out for the STP. I have many questions about it. I will be having an STP ambassador on in a couple weeks and asking him to give a bunch of details. So look forward to that episode. My knee continues to be a question. I'm working on the stretching exercises that I hope will help. It's more challenging than it seems like it should be to take the time to stretch. However, I'm doing 1,000% better than I've done in a very long time. I am always looking for professionals to give me more insight on stretching. So when I got a chance to talk to Mihai Suvagau, I had to talk to him about my knee. I knew of Mihai from mutual friends, and I thought he would give some really useful info. Really, from the very beginning of our conversations, I knew I wanted to have him on the podcast. And here is our discussion. It's great to welcome Mihai Suvagau here to the podcast. Thanks for coming and joining, sharing your expertise, Mihai.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited.
I met Mihai a couple weeks ago, and I was describing to him the issue that's going on with my knee, the inflammation of my bursa in my knee, and that the course of action for it is to be more limber, with the thought that if I was more limber, there would be less pressure on the bursa. So Mihai and I started having a conversation, and I immediately was like, okay, I want to capture this conversation on the podcast. And Mihai, you were really busy at the time, which was fine, but I'm glad we've got this opportunity to continue the conversation here. The first question that I have is, could you talk about what you heard me saying? Do you remember what you heard me saying that caused you to want to give me a different understanding of stretching? Or maybe it's best to say a broader understanding of flexibility.
Sorry, real quick. I think you said you're doing a lot of static stretching, both prior and post. So both before and after your bike rides.
Yeah.
I think I asked you at the time if you're doing any more dynamic movements to deal with it. And if I remember correctly, I think it was just a static stretching that you were doing.
Yeah.
So I kind of got into a whole tangent on that.
Which was an awesome tangent, by the way. I really enjoyed the tangent. What I saw as we were talking, where you kind of were listening, and then it was almost like I could see the wheels turning, like maybe I should say something about this. So I'm glad you did. But I think you heard me maybe expressing some things that you see that are common misconceptions about stretching and flexibility. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that. What are some of the big misunderstandings that you see as far as stretching and flexibility?
When we look at the body overall, we tend to just break it apart and say, well, it's my knee, it's my hip, it's my whatever, right? So then we focus on flexibility and try to improve flexibility in those joints or We'll try to increase strength in those areas. But the big picture is the body works as a whole. When you're having an issue like in a certain area, you can't just look at that area, but you have to look at the overall picture and say, what is everything else doing? Because the tissues are not getting shortened just in a certain area for no reason. But why is that? Why are you dealing with the symptoms in that area? And this is nothing against physical therapists. I'm a physical therapy assistant. I understand the science behind static stretching. There's definitely a place where a physical therapist will give you a prescribed stretch for a reason. And again, nothing against that whatsoever. But it's just when we start looking at the stretching overall and mobility and flexibility, we can't rely on stretching just one body part at a time, but understanding how the body functions and why we are dealing with that issue. And static stretching has a place, but static stretching has certain drawbacks. But just basically understanding the body as a whole, not just breaking it apart into segments. That's what I got into.
And I got a little ahead of myself here. I'm really excited about asking these questions. I should stop and say that you are a personal trainer and you're also, like you said, a physical therapy assistant. And so this is something that you deal with constantly with your profession.
Yeah.
That's, again, what's driving my interest in your perspective on this. So you're talking about a concept of dealing with the body, and I'm thinking this is a concept that influences a lot of what you do with people when you do training. I'm wondering, when you first encountered the information that builds the foundation of how you work with people, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how you first got interested in physical training as a career, and kind of, again, what has influenced you to be where you are now, the way that you work with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started out ended up taking a weight training class in high school, and I loved it, and I took it multiple times, and I liked that aspect of it. I liked the aspect of getting stronger and getting more fit and understanding that. And so a couple of years on the road, about 18 years old, I got into a gym and started working out and just doing a lot of the kind of old school, we think of like old school way of training, like, bench press and leg presses and things like that. And just kind of grew up, working out that way. And then I ended up, I went through, I'm a massage therapist as well. I'm a licensed massage therapist. I became a licensed massage therapist. And I had all these strengths in a way, but at the same time, I didn't realize it. There was a lot of like, kind of like we're talking about like segmentation earlier, which applies for like the way people misunderstand flexibility. There's also the idea of like kind of a segmentation and like kind of an old school way of training. That like, you train body parts, you train arms, you train legs, you train core, you train whatever, right? But you're not training it as a whole. So I had all these different like strengths, but then weaknesses at the same time, which started showing up. So in my mid-20s, I ended up going back to school for a degree in exercise science. And so at that point, when I was in college, one of my professors, he started bringing up a lot of the kind of a Gary Gray. I know we talked about that, but it's a movement based and understanding movement from what he calls a three-dimensional aspect. We don't just do a bicep curl. That's not a natural movement. We don't just go and do certain things like tricep pull downs. Like that's not a natural movement. We isolate those exercises, we isolate those muscles, but that's not the way the body works. So essentially, it's just now understanding that the way the body works is we move in these three-dimensional planar movements. And I realized, the video's not visible on this. So I'm throwing my arms around, but it's, for me, like we reach back for something and reach forward, and we twist to the left and twist to the right. So these movements, we don't really do so much in like a gym setting, or at least we haven't done so much. Just that segmentation. So kind of like understanding that. And I really, at first I fought it. I didn't really want to see it that way because coming out of the kind of old school background, I didn't want to see that. I kind of wanted to keep going with that. But then over time, I started realizing more and more the science behind it and how that applies to our bodies. That we're not meant to be doing these segmented movements, just like we're not meant to be stretching just one muscle for no reason, but we're meant to be like focusing on the movements, right? So for understanding the way the body, the mechanics actually work. And one thing I share with you is hamstring flexibility is so misunderstood because people say all the time, well, I have tight hamstrings. Well, do you have a tilted pelvis? Anterior tilt means like essentially like your low back is kind of arched, and you're going to see that like once you get an example of it, you'll see it and see it everywhere, right? because we sit so much, all of us, we end up in these positions on a daily basis. They end up screwing our body mechanics and they're screwing our postures. Now what happens is you have shortened hip flexors. It throws your pelvis into anterior tilt. And now that puts a stress on the hamstrings, and the hamstrings are shortened. Is that what's happening? Even if that's the case, should we just go over switching the hip flexors in a static position on the floor? Or should we rather focus on driving it and opening it up from a kind of a movement base?
What I'm hearing is this, that our modern lifestyle, that one, our body is not really designed to do that. Yeah, that's one thing. And then when we're training specific muscle groups, would you say it's contributing to an imbalance that we're getting, or it's just not addressing an imbalance that we're getting from kind of the modern lifestyle of sitting at a computer?
Oh, absolutely. It's doing potentially a little bit of both. First off, posture matters. Posture matters quite a bit. I've had disagreements with physical therapists. If anybody's listening, if PT's listening on this, I love you guys, but I have had like scientific disagreements over this. And there's a big push right now in the physical therapy community where there's actually kind of a posture that doesn't really matter. And so scientifically, we can always look at studies that kind of show things both ways. But there are a lot of studies that do show that posture matters. We always want to be as upright as possible. That matters all the time because, over time, while you may not be seeing the symptoms right away, over time you will. Being bent over, having kyphotic posture is going to be causing a lot of other issues, over time. Well, you may not be feeling it today. Down the road, you will feel certain things, right? In the grand scheme of posture, our goal is constantly to be upright because gravity is not easy on us. That's one of the things. That's as simplistic as possible. We want to be upright. Now, what happens is in our day-to-day life, we get into situations where we sit down a lot. So sitting down a lot puts us in a flexed position, right? A hip flexion position. So if I sit down, now look at you're basically in a position where your legs are closer to your body. That's a hip flexion. So you're in a short position. We sit down so much that throws us into anterior pelvic tilt, kind of what we talked about earlier, because it becomes a chronic thing that we put ourselves into. You also see people's shoulders round forward because, again, we sit a lot and we do a lot of things in front of us, right? And we just kind of become a product of our environment. So over time, over 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of doing things a certain way, you just kind of become that. It's just one of those things where modern life, we've never really sat as much as we do today. We're essentially experimenting on ourselves to see what happens. When we see how much back pain we're dealing with, they say over 80% of Westerners will experience back pain during their lifetime. Whereas we look at people from third world countries, it's about 8% or so. Last time I saw those statistics. It makes no sense, except it does, because this is definitely one of the reasons, because, we're putting ourselves in positions where, there's all this stress on the body that it shouldn't be that way. So then when we are exercising, kind of going back to what we talked about, when I'm going back and I'm exercising in the gym, what do? People go and do sit-ups. They do crunches, which does what? Puts them in a more, again, it's a flex position. Should you be doing all this extra trunk flexion if you're already in flexion all day long? We're making things worse. And even when we're talking about I'm going to train my back. Well, how are you going to train your back? What does that look like? And I'm not saying that there's obviously certain things that will go bad right away and you'll go, that hurts. But there's a lot of effects that you don't see over time. So yes, certain things can make things worse. And then also not understanding kind of the function of posture, and B, I've worked as a fitness trainer for, 16, 17 years. I've been doing this for quite a while. And most trainers have a very, very bleak understanding as to what exercises do. The fact that everything that you do will lead to some sort of there's an outcome. So as you strengthen up a muscle, you are strengthening up the way that works. You're also strengthening up whatever that muscle does, right? So if you look at your chest, you look at your pecs, all this bench press, you're going to see a lot of guys in the gym where their arms are kind of caved in, right? So you have that because all they're doing is focusing on the chest all day long. What good does that do other than just help them flex in the mirror? So now they're putting themselves in an even worse position, kind of forward, kind of coming back to kind of a flex position, right?
You're describing a condition where what is pushing some of what's being done in the gym is aesthetics. I want to look a certain way. But from a practical standpoint, when we go out in life, that's not really an activity that happens in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I look at it is we are a very advanced computer, if you will, that God designed. Humans cannot create yet what God has created. How many times you see people step into a gym and they go, I don't really know what to do with this equipment? Well, because these are not natural movements. What you're taking is you're taking a very advanced computer and you're downgrading. You're putting this input, this like software downgrade to a certain like movements that we're doing in the gym. They're not conducive to what God has designed. They're not conducive to what we're doing. So if you start kind of going back and trying to understand like what is movement supposed to look like, because we should strengthen up what should be right. Would you agree? Like we should strengthen up the way things should move and encourage that behavior versus introducing artificial movements into it. So what you see in the gym, for example, from a workout perspective, you see a lot of stuff that has come from the world of bodybuilding. But the world of bodybuilding is all about aesthetics. It's either come from the world of bodybuilding, it's come from the world of powerlifting, which I have another problem with. And then it's come, from some of the athletics department. And that stuff I like. A lot of that stuff, actually, a lot of it does have a lot more to do with movement, what it's supposed to look like. Not all of it, but a lot of it does, right? From the perspective of the weightlifting, we need to be able to go back and say, what does actually look like real life? How will this improve what I do? So kind of go back to your early question is when I work with my clients, the goal becomes, yes, of course, they want to lose weight, focus on strength and improve performance overall in life. But then we're looking at making sure they stay safe. They don't get injured. So as they're going through that weight loss and strengthening process, we're strengthening as much as possible the right and the correct way that the body works so they don't get injured both in the gym and going down in life. And then also they achieve everything else at the same time. Because if we can understand the way the body moves, then you're not going to be fighting things. You're not going to be fighting things every step of the way. You're not going to be dealing with what do you have back pain? Why do you have knee pain? Why do you have we have to go back and understand why is this happening? And understand it from a biomechanical standpoint, because things don't hurt for no reason. That's kind of what I'm going back. Does that make sense? It's understanding how does this work? What are we designed to do? So first thing that we're designed to do is walk. We're designed to walk. We're designed to run. Now I understand some people have had joint damage and other things. So obviously not everybody can run. We want to encourage, if possible, walking, running, right? These are important. We're meant to be bipedal. We're meant to be able to do these things. Throwing is not something that we do. We do it in certain sports. We're not trained for it, right? But if you look at the movement of the pecs, of the pectoralis, this is what we're supposed to be doing with it. It's both a rotational movement, which is kind of what you see in golf and things like that. But it's also obviously involves the shoulder, the chest, all that, right? So that's one of them. So you see that in things not just throwing, but if cutting wood or see this for the same movement. It's that chopping movement. We don't do those. And then obviously we're designed to pull, but typically when you pull in real life, and I'm not saying you shouldn't pull with two arms. You can, but a lot of times you see you pull with one arm, right? So we definitely but understanding that what does pulling look like in that situation? Can you press kind of like a bench press looking movement? Sure, I guess if you're pushing somebody away from you, but how often does that happen? And the correlation, if you can bench press 400 pounds on the ground, you can only press so much standing up because you don't have a bench behind you. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say is when we look at movement, understand movement, and then strengthen up the movement and improve those movements, because unfortunately, we are losing the ability to move a certain way just due to our lifestyle.
You had mentioned Gary Gray and the Gray Institute as influencing you in this realm. Can you talk a little bit more about their contribution to the issue of training?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gary Gray is a physical therapist from Adrian, Michigan. It's him and the Gray Institute also. There's a bunch of physical therapists basically at the front of it. They've been around for quite a while, and they've done a lot as far as understanding the function and movement overall. You see, there's a lot of physical therapists. He's a physical therapist. A lot of physical therapists that follow that kind of understanding, and it's a lot of what he calls chain reaction from my foot all the way to my shoulder. If I throw everything, it's not just my shoulder throwing. So we look at throwers. If throwers have a problem, is because they're just throwing from the shoulder. It's not just the shoulder throwing. It's your whole body. You should be able to see that from the ankle on up, right? That movement is going up the chain, right? He has a lot when it comes down to movement. Like I've studied a lot of this stuff. I'm working on some of this stuff right now. Actually, probably going to be studying a lot of this stuff for quite a while. They're very much so. They've been at the forefront of a lot of this for a while, and they still are when it comes down to movement.
I'm guessing that when you're looking at someone, there's this element of changing your perspective of training when you get introduced to this information. And it seems like kind of doing an evaluation of someone, doing an assessment of someone, there's maybe more of a comprehensive approach, kind of looking in a broad way at assessing someone's function. How would you talk about that assessment process that you would go through?
You're right. I mean, if we look at again going back to Gary Gray has an assessment that he calls 3D maps. It's for everybody listening. If you guys want to go and look up the 3D maps, it's really interesting, and it's kind of looking at the way the body moves. So you can cross the leg over and reach back and do all these different movements and seeing where does that break and chain. And that's definitely something that I have used, and I'll use different parts of it depending on who I'm working with. And then we also have, because I'm a fitness trainer, we look at overall strength conditioning. So we look at things like lunging is a very functional movement. So lunging is pretty functional because if you look at it, we always prioritize squats, but squats are not that complicated. And squats are, if you look at it, the squatting up and down, right? So like if you look at squats, even babies will squat first, they'll stand up first, and then they'll walk, because walking is more complicated. So when we start looking at the lunging gives me a lot of an idea of what's going on with their, like, if I see a lot of like ankle instability, if I see a lot of whatever's going on, I feel like, some of the hip issues a lot of times in it. Because now when you're in one leg and you're doing the lunges, now we can start seeing something. So that's one of the use for the lower body. And then I do use a push-up to understand a little bit kind of how they are able to, in a modified push-up as well, to be able to kind of integrate the whole chain. So in that position now, if you start the hips are going crazy or something like that, then we start looking into, well, how well are you communicating with all of that? And then from there, we start looking at different movements and chopping movements and stuff like that, and see what that looks like from a stand-up position. Again, it depends, but these are some of the ones that I kind of go through with everyone, just to kind of see a little bit on how they move and how they integrate the whole body. Because that's one thing we're talking about, is like integration and movement integration.
It seems like there's a bit of education that you need to do with people when they come see you, that they understand that what they're going to come away with is maybe different than what they've traditionally thought of fitness training being.
Yes and no. I think a lot of times when people step into the gym and they're willing to work with the trainer, they also are not really they're not pretty confident about kind of what they know and what's going on, right? So when it comes down to the movement, for the most part, people are pretty receptive. Most people will not say, I need to work on my posture. I want to work on my posture. Now, don't get me wrong. I do have people that come in for that, or people that come in and say like, hey, I have back pain. That's what's going on. But then it's just the selection that I go through as to kind of what I do with them. Is obviously I'm still working on, if the primary goal is weight loss, we're still working towards that goal. At the same time, the selection of the exercise that I'm using is to also improve the body mechanics. I tell them some stuff, but a lot of times people just kind of want to like, hey man, look, just take me from point A to point B.
Okay.
Right.
I'm just going to do what you tell me to do.
Exactly. And then they have like their warm up to do. And their warm up is honestly the kind of the 3D, the Gary Gray 3D maps, right? So like that's a great way to like warm up into the movements. But that's a way, like for me, I kind of get them into it. I kind of get them introduced into it without even having to kind of start going to the whole Gary Gray and just here, do this. This is your warm up. Okay. Perfect. So they go through it and they make it happen. And now things go well and we're all happy. I mean, it depends on who I'm talking to. And sometimes I'm going to, sit down and have a little more of a breakdown. But for the most part, people kind of trust the process. And as long as they see the results, they're happy with it.
I think of three different things, and maybe there's more, but I think of strength, I think of flexibility, and I think of balance as three important things. And I'm thinking they're probably very interrelated. I'm wondering if you could comment on that a bit about those three things, or add other things and kind of the interrelated nature of them.
You're totally right. Balance is a huge part of it. And that's one of the things that we have to look at, because they all kind of connect. If I have a lot of strength but I have no balance, could I use that?
No.
Probably not, right? So the same thing with if I have a lot of strength, but I don't have any mobility, can I function in life? Yeah, I can, but am I going to be functioning my best? There's some really interesting stuff when we start looking at, you're going to notice like powerlifters and bodybuilders, they're extremely stiff. I don't know if you have if you had a whole lot of interaction with some of the big boys, right? But they move terrible. They move really bad. Like their movement is just off. And I mean, they just the way they walk, they kind of walk like a Terminator. It's stiff. It doesn't look natural. And I have a lot of friends in that community. A lot of them are dealing with back pain, and we can talk about like as to why that's happening. But it's just their mechanics. They're just big and they're stiff because their whole focus is to put on as much muscle mass and so forth without thinking of movement and performance and what that looks like. So if you ever had a chance to look at a track athlete versus a bodybuilder, look at how they move. It's night and day. It's just not right. It looks artificial because it is created artificial. When you look at strength, kind of we're going back and say, like, what are we strengthening? Are we strengthening a muscle or are we strengthening a movement? And if we're strengthening that movement, like, okay, in powerlifting, they strengthen up a certain movement. But that movement is the exact, it's two movements, okay? Even though they'll tell you it's three, there's squat, there's deadlift, and there's bench press. But the squat and the deadlift is about the same thing. You either have the bar on your back or you're picking up the bar off the floor. It's the exact same thing. It's a hip flexion. You pick up the weight, you stand up. And the other one, you're on the bench and you push up the weight off your chest. You unrack it, touch the chest, bring it back up. They're doing two movements. Okay, they're both in sagittal planes. So when we look at it, we have three planes of movement: a frontal, sagittal, and we have transverse. That's to be said. Like when you go into like, it's just that like it comes towards me in a way, right? It coming up and down. It's a 2D movement. There's no transverse. There's just that sagittal movement. Just that's all they're doing with it. That's why you look at powerlifters, they become very stiff because they only train one certain movement. They'll tell you they might go, oh, we'll do some auxiliary movements, and then it's like some tiny little movement to kind of like complement what they've been doing the whole time. Kind of going back, the other one is flexibility. That's kind of what we got into. Because there's a misunderstanding between flexibility and mobility. Just because you can get your leg to a certain degree, can you get that under control there? Just because I can get it on the floor in a certain motion, in a certain place, right? Like if I can get the strap under and I stretch my hamstring, can I perform? Do I have the strength to be able to perform in that range of motion? And when we look at like improving mobility, we want to improve that range of motion. Not only can you get there, but you can function there. You actually can use that there. Does that make sense?
Right.
People say like, well, I need to, my hip flexors are tight, I need to stretch, and they kind of get on the floor, do a hip flexor stretch on the floor, right? But a lot of times it's your quads, especially like your rectus femoris, it's one of your quad muscles. It passes two joints. So by that, it's like meaning like your hip and your knee. And if that becomes shortened, kind of like from a sitting down for too much, then you have to go back and say like, how do we stretch this in a way that it creates? So we have to have both a knee bend, have like a knee flexion and a hip extension to be able to create that stretch on it, which you can do it. You can do it on the floor if you know what you're doing, or you can also do it if you know what you can also do that standing up and be able to use that. Now I'm going through a movement. I'm not just passively hanging out there, but I'm going through a movement. Does that make sense? So now I'm going there, I'm controlling that. So not only am I like putting myself on the floor in an official place and I can kind of hold that, but now I can actually move that. So we want to strengthen. We want strength, we want mobility, and we want stability. And we want those three things to kind of like marry together, to have them in a place where like, yeah, you have that. You have both the balance. You can balance yourself there. You're not losing your balance all over the place. And you have the mobility to reach back, and you have the strength to, whatever, be that explode out of there or chop wood or whatever. Like your overall, everything functions well. A lot of people are doing yoga. And yoga is one of those things that I have a bit of a bone to pick. Yoga is not ancient. It's a 5,000-year-old art. That's not the case, you guys. So yoga is actually pretty new as we look at it. The original asanas, the original ones are 5 or 7. It doesn't matter the count of them, but they were all in a sitting position. So when you look at like the statues of Buddha, that's more or less like what the original like yoga asanas look like. People like the monks would get in that position, they would just sit there and meditate. That was it. The movement came on way later. And I think it was 19th century, mid 19th century, where, believe it or not, Swedish gymnastics had crossed into yoga. So when you start seeing in yoga, all those like inverted positions and those are all from Swedish gymnastics. That was not in yoga prior. And then later on, they try to use yoga to strengthen up, to use it as a strengthening exercise for the army. So when you start looking at the warrior pose, for example, that's what like what they try to put together, kind of a workout yoga. So it's become an evolutionary thing, and kind of what we see now is just again it changed again and it evolved more in the 20th century, like mid 20th century, so on up. So what we see yoga today, it's nothing ancient, nothing. I mean, it's yoga is just it's an evolution. I'm not saying it's bad as a whole, but one of the problems with yoga is all that static stretching. What we're seeing is one of the studies I looked at, it was something like 10% of people that do yoga end up in like essentially going to the doctor, emergency room, and so forth, due to injuries, overstretching. Like we're talking about stretching, like, and this is one thing that when we were talking is when you're stretching something, a muscle, you're not just stretching that muscle, but you're also stretching the joint capsules. You're stretching all the other soft tissue. Joint instability, it's never a good thing. Just because we think like I'm stretching my tricep or whatever, like you're not just stretching that particular muscle, but you're also stretching the joint capsules, which creates instability in the joints, creates injuries. You're stretching like all the ligaments, like everything gets stretched, not just the muscle itself. So we're seeing injuries with yoga. Yoga is not like it's great for everyone. Now, a lot of people are not going to experience pain or discomfort with yoga, and that's great. And a lot of people will experience pain and discomfort while taking yoga and not associated with it. Some other incidents, something like 87% of people that have started doing yoga experience some pain, during the first year of taking yoga. It's that like you're stretching, you're stretching, you're stretching. Well, where's the stability? You just really stretched your joints, but where are you creating that? Where's the stability for that? Now you have unstable joints. Now you're overstretching muscle. So that's one of the issues, kind of what we're talking about, like with stretching, because like static stretching, for example, it diminishes performance. So you're never going to see athletes do static stretches and then jump on the court. You're never going to see that. But what they'll do is they'll do a dynamic stretching, dynamic warm-ups. I'm sure you've seen things like that, like the hip circles and things like that, right? That is a great way to go at it, because now you're taking that through the range of motion and you're warming up that movement, right? So typically when you see static stretching, it's going to be reserved for after the exercise, after the movement. And again, even then going back to it, is that needed? If so, like how much should you do it? And just kind of making sure that like whatever you're doing there, like if you're under the supervision of a healthcare professional to kind of tells you do this, then you're probably doing okay. But if you're just picking up stretching just to stretch, that may not be the way to go.
Now we have a situation in North America, and I have to say I'm part of that, which is that I set a lot, not out chopping wood. I'm not out harvesting crops by hand. I'm not climbing trees to get stuff. None of these activities that were done 200 years ago or whatever to survive, or 500 years ago or whatever. I'm not doing any of that. If you imagined a world where we all decided, okay, what we're going to do every morning before we start our day is that we're going to do dynamic movement. If we made that shift, what do you think the difference would be as far as injury prevention and pain reduction and some of these things that are kind of chronic in our culture right now?
It's a good question. One thing that comes to mind is Tai Chi. If you know what Tai Chi looks like, that is a better approach to movement and kind of a warm up, because now you're standing, you're taking your body through these movements, and you're creating that flexibility. And flexibility, like if we learn anything from Tai Chi, is that frankly, there's a lot of older people doing it. And older people we associate with stiffness. And yet you see all these older people and they're happily able to go through the movements. At any given time, we can improve posture, we can improve movements. When we look at low back pain, for example, I know we kind of brought that up earlier. One of the reasons for low back pain is what we call lack of thoracic mobility. It means your mid back is just not moving properly, because things like, how we say, like cultivating crops and chopping wood and stuff like that, like we don't do that anymore. I don't do it, certainly. We don't do that anymore for the most part, at least not in the cities. When you go through some of these things and creating and maintaining, so as you age or as you like do anything, be able to maintain those movements. It's like if you don't use it, you lose it. Well, that applies to this. If you don't use this, if you don't use certain movements, if you don't use certain like ranges of motion, over time you're going to lose it. And so when you start losing those, when you start losing, like when you think, let's talk about joints depend on that lubrication. You're going through that. And obviously it's not just as simple as that, but we can improve joint mobility. We can improve like overall back mobility.
Creating kind of this habit of
Sure.
Tai Chi in the park every morning. I mean, that would be amazing to see what would happen as far as some of the things that we see, lower back pain and compressed discs and knee pain and everything. It would be amazing to see what kind of impact that would have on North America, to see that kind of trend take off.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at, you brought up the disc and back pain, right? So when we look at back pain, a big issue of it is like spinal compression that we are dealing with on a daily basis because we're sitting down. We know that sitting down is one of the worst things you can do. The spinal compression it's at its highest when we're literally sitting down on the chair. So if we're doing that consistently for like time over time, hours and hours and hours and hours and hours a day, now we're dealing with the after effects 40, 50, 60 years into it. So if we can get up, even in between sitting down, get up and do some movements, actually open up. Because remember, we lose that ability to go into extension, to go back, to lean back, to reach back, right? Being able to open up and fight gravity, because gravity is going to keep fighting you constantly. It's going to try to pull you down. We want to fight that. We want to be able to be upright. We want to be able to like function properly. So even if we just on a daily basis, we can just take, like 5 minutes here and there to do some movements, that can go a long way.
So let's bring that into the world of cycling, which is what I'm focused on and what this podcast is focused on. As you describe extension, as you describe like opening up and your arms are moving back and you're like reaching back,
Right.
Cycling seems almost the opposite of that, where you are leaning forward, you're in flexion. I don't know if that is the right way to say it. And, the position that you have, and especially as if you're riding in an aerodynamic position, it seems like this is adding to the problem rather than helping problems. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So then you can still have to say and look at, okay, well, how can I fight off the side effects, if you will, right? And one of them is kind of going back to what I said, right? Going back and focusing on those like opening movements. I also absolutely love the foam roller. I don't know if you've used it in the past, but I love getting that foam roller, being able to lay on it, just lay on the floor, allowing to just your back to open up a little bit. It's a great tool for it. Our goal, it doesn't matter who we are. It doesn't matter if you're a cyclist, doesn't matter if you're a baker, doesn't matter if you're a computer scientist, it doesn't matter what you do, who we are. Our goal ultimately is to move better in life and to not have back pain and to feel good overall. And in order to do that is we always have to go back and say, we want to be upright. We want to be balanced, right? We'll talk about more that like, the shoulders, the hips and so forth. That's a different discussion. But again, we want to bring that into balance. And then we want to be able to move properly out of those. Everything else that we do, our goal is always to go back to, okay, well, yes. And how do we make sure that this doesn't make that worse? How do we make sure that the cycling or the baking or computer work or doing dishes or whatever, it's not making things worse? We have to constantly try to like undo some of the damage we do to ourselves and go back and say, like, how do we do this? How do we improve? How do we make sure that now on the bicycle, you're both in a hip flexion and a knee flexion position, right? So what happens in there? Like, what's going on in there? Like, is that, like over time, you're going to be dealing with certain like side effects. But it's saying like, how can we go back and say like, just because I do this, doesn't mean that I have to deal with the side effects of it. How can I make sure that I don't have side effects from that, but I can still enjoy the things that I like to do and enjoy in life, right? Arguably, cycling is a healthy activity. And we can definitely, like, I'm behind it 100%. But then, like, saying, how do we undo some of the stuff that we can do to ourselves? I have some friends that are like they're world class cyclists. They've competed in a lot of Ironman triathlons and stuff, and they've done a lot of things. But their posture's terrible because they don't think of that, and they just keep focusing on their sport.
It's really a situation of augmenting cycling and thinking about, okay, I'm going to spend some time on the bike, but then I also want to spend some time off the bike, augmenting what I'm doing with some range of motion activities that are going to balance out some of the position that I have on the bike.
Yeah, absolutely. Because whatever you like to do in life, it's always going back and saying, I like to do this, and I want to make sure that I'm feeling good at the end of the day. So it's just augmenting that the cycling experience.
I think that's very important, especially what I'm talking about. In my specific case, I was experiencing a lot of health problems from being sedentary. And I chose cycling because I love cycling. So for me, if I go from being sedentary, if I go from setting all day long, and then cycling is like my only outlet, then while I might lose weight, see benefits with my blood pressure, I see benefits with my blood sugar, there's still this, I don't know, structural integrity or whatever that I'm not going to see by exclusively cycling, that I'm going to need to augment it with other things.
Yeah, and that's what we're saying, because when in that position on the cycle on the bicycle or a motorcycle for that matter, but when in that position, like what you're dealing with, you're putting your body in a certain position. Like if you look at it, we talked about that thoracic rotation that most of us lack, the ability to like twist. Well, there's no thoracic mobility happening in it, right? You're in a flex position the whole time. So there's definitely a lot of like especially being there for hours and hours, you put yourself in a certain position. But again, when I tell my clients, I'm like, look, at the end of the night, hit the reset button on what you've done through the day. So like you can still get yourself and you have a good time here, and then you still work towards the great big goals.
Excellent. Well, I think that's really beneficial. I'm really interested for, any listeners out there, if you've thought about this before, and especially if you've taken steps to address the specific thing, if you've found specific exercises that you do, movement that you do that helps provide balance. I'd love to hear from people like what they found that's really helpful. And also, I'll give some links in the show notes for some things that I think people can find interesting as far as evaluating this element of providing more of a holistic way of getting healthy that maybe cycling isn't as complete as we would like it to be. Thanks so much, Mihai, for joining me and for sharing your expertise. I would love to have you back sometime and talk about other things. I think that your experience and the way that you're working with people is awesome. And I just appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to hear some of the feedback. I know some people are going to disagree with me, and I love to hear that as well. There's definitely a debate to be had about some of the static and versus dynamic and how that plays out. But I had a good time.
Well, again, thanks so much for taking the time, and we'll have an opportunity to talk more later, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.
Mihai asked, are we strengthening a muscle or are we strengthening a movement? In my case, I am building strength for a very specific reason. That reason is to move my bike and my body for 206 miles as fast as I can. But that doesn't really mean that I'm doing something that is building strength in a comprehensive way. If I was walking 206 miles, I would be doing a much more natural movement. The machine that is my bike puts me in a non-natural position for all the time I am riding. After talking to Mihai, I believe I need to do something that provides natural movement, strength, and flexibility. That doesn't in any way mean that I'm going to stop cycling, but it does mean that I want to find some exercises that focus more on natural movement so that I can augment my cycling. I see this as a difficult challenge. First of all, I don't know where to find the time to integrate a dynamic movement program into my fitness activities. I'm already struggling to fit in stretching. Secondly, it honestly sounds really boring. These might seem like lame challenges, but I am pretty aware of what gets in my way as far as fitness is concerned. I will keep you all posted on this part of my journey. If you would like to reach out and speak to Mihai about your situation, he said that email would be the best way, and I have put his email in the show notes. I have now heard from a few listeners of the podcast, and it is always great. I would like to hear your fitness story. Please reach out on my Instagram or shoot me an email. You can find the link to my email in the show notes, and the Instagram is cyclingover60 with 60 spelled out. I would love to hear from you. That is it for now. I hope that you are planning some great cycling adventures for the summer. Remember, age is just a gear change.